Amanda had been living in the crystalline caves for almost 5 years when she first understood that the dragons were waiting for her. The caves were located 30 kilometers from the main human settlement and 20 kilometers from the elf enclave that clung to the eastern ridge of Meridian Prime. She had chosen this isolation deliberately, and the elders of her community had accepted her decision with the kind of resignation that suggested they thought she was wasting her life on foolish pursuits. Her parents had wanted her to take a position as a healer in the settlement medical center. The human administrators had tried to recruit her into their research programs after discovering that she possessed an unusual affinity for studying biological systems. Even her closest friend Marion had suggested that her skills would be better used serving the colony, rather than living alone in caves studying ancient rock formations and the strange crystalline structures that grew from the stone walls. But Amanda knew something that none of them understood. The crystals were not just geological formations, they were communications devices. She had discovered this truth on her 3rd year in the caves when a particular cluster of crystals began to pulse with soft blue light. At first, she thought the reaction was caused by some mineral reaction to the seasonal temperature changes. But then she realized the pulses were responding to her emotional state. When she was afraid, the crystals turned a darker shade of blue. When she felt wonder or joy, they brightened to a pale silver. It was on the day after her realization that she first saw Ember. The small dragon had emerged from a tunnel that Amanda had never noticed before. Despite having walked past that section of cave wall hundreds of times, Ember was no more than 2 meters long, with scales that shimmered like opalescent glass. The dragon's eyes were different from any animal eyes Amanda had ever seen. They held a quality of ancient intelligence mixed with curiosity. Amanda had frozen, her hand extended toward the crystalline formations. Ember approached slowly, as if understanding that sudden movements might terrify the elf woman. When the dragon's nose finally touched Amanda's palm, Amanda felt something shift in her understanding of reality. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was recognition. Images flooded through her mind in quick succession. She saw vast galaxies spinning through darkness. She saw worlds that burned under suns of many colors. She saw other dragons, thousands of them flying through space that shimmered with colors human eyes could not perceive. She saw ships with insignias bearing the symbol of the Kelian Empire. She saw hunters. She saw conflict. She saw death, and beneath it all she felt loneliness, a profound and ancient loneliness that had lasted for centuries. When the connection broke, Amanda fell to her knees, gasping. Her heart was racing and tears streamed down her face. Ember made a sound that might have been curiosity or concern, a low rumble that resonated through the cave and caused the crystals to glow brighter. Over the following weeks, Amanda learned to control the connection. She discovered that she could open her mind to the dragons in measured doses, preventing the overwhelming flood of sensation. She learned that Ember was the youngest of the 3 dragons that inhabited the deep caves below Meridian Prime's surface. Ember had been born on a world that orbited a star that humans had never named and elves had never seen. The larger dragons, Storm and Ash, revealed their histories to her more slowly. Storm was over 300 years old, a guardian who had lost his entire flock to the weapons of the Kelian Empire. Ash was younger, perhaps only 150 cycles, but she carried within her the genetic memories of a civilization that had spanned multiple solar systems before it had been systematically destroyed by the Imperial forces that sought to control all sentient life in this sector of the galaxy. Amanda learned that the dragons could not reproduce naturally on Meridian Prime. The world's atmospheric composition was wrong. The radiation levels from the sun were harmful to dragon eggs. The gravity was different enough to cause metabolic stress in their ancient biological systems. They had come to this world not to thrive but to hide, to wait, to preserve what remained of their kind until the day when it might be safe to emerge again. She understood then why they had allowed her to touch them, why they had opened their minds to her despite the risk. They had sensed that she was different from the other colonists. She had spent years reaching out to the natural world of Meridian Prime, studying its ecosystems with genuine curiosity rather than desire for exploitation. She had shown the dragons something that their kind had not experienced. In centuries of fleeing and hiding from predatory species, she had shown them kindness without expectation of return. Amanda began spending entire weeks in the caves without returning to the settlement. She would bring supplies of food and equipment, setting up a more permanent camp in the largest chamber where all 3 dragons could gather comfortably. She learned to meditate while connected to them, to let their consciousness flow through her without losing her own sense of self. The dragons taught her their history not through words, but through experiential memory. She lived through the peaceful centuries before the Kelian Empire had begun its expansion. She felt the wonder of flying through nebulae and seeing planets form from cosmic dust. She experienced the first encounters with the Kelian explorers, encounters that had begun with diplomatic gestures but had quickly turned to violence when the Empire realized that dragons could not be enslaved or controlled through conventional means. She saw the great battles. She felt the loss as entire colonies of dragons were destroyed. She understood the weight of being among the last survivors of a civilization that had once filled entire galaxies with their presence. On the 50th day of her extended stay in the caves, Amanda was sitting with her back pressed against Ember's side when she felt something different in the connection. A new kind of urgency, a new kind of fear. The dragons were sensing something on the solar wind, something that was moving through space toward Meridian Prime with intent and purpose. Ash's mental communication was clear and sharp. A Kelian probe had entered the system. It was performing standard scans, the kind of investigation that happened before an invasion fleet. It had detected the unusual energy signatures emanating from the dragon's crystalline cave systems. The Empire would know that something here was worth investigating. It might take time for them to send a fleet, but the probe meant that Meridian Prime's days of being an unknown colony world were ending. The Empire was coming to Meridian Prime. Amanda felt Storm's massive form shift beside her, and she knew that the eldest dragon was making a decision. They could flee. The dragons were capable of space travel using methods of propulsion that the humans of Meridian Prime had not yet developed. They could leave this world and search for another hidden refuge somewhere in the vast reaches of the galaxy. But to do so, they would have to abandon Amanda. They would have to abandon the settlement of humans and elves who had no idea that they were about to become the target of the most dangerous military power in this sector of space. Amanda opened her eyes and stared at the glowing crystals surrounding her. She reached out and touched the warm scales beneath her, feeling the doubt and fear that even these ancient creatures were experiencing. She made a decision that would change the destiny of Meridian Prime forever. She would not let the dragons flee alone. Amanda returned to the settlement 3 days later, and she knew immediately that something had changed. The atmosphere in the colony was tense in a way that suggested that the leadership already knew about the Kelian probe. She could see the increased security at the main checkpoint. The human military personnel were moving with the kind of purposeful intensity that preceded major decisions. She went directly to the administrative center, where she knew she would find the human commander on duty. Victoria was standing in front of a large display screen that showed the solar system with various orbital markers and trajectory predictions. She looked up as Amanda entered, and her expression hardened into something that resembled suspicion mixed with acknowledgement. "You have been gone from the settlement for more than 6 weeks," Victoria said without preamble. "During that time, we detected energy signatures and unusual readings from the crystal caves in the eastern frontier. You want to tell me why you were ignoring the mandatory check-in protocols?" Amanda took a deep breath. She had prepared herself for this moment since she made the decision to return. She knew that Victoria was a pragmatist and a professional soldier. She also knew that Victoria had shown more genuine curiosity about the colony's unique environment than most of the other human administrators who cycled through Meridian Prime. "I need to show you something," Amanda said. "It will be difficult for you to believe, but you need to see it for yourself, and you need to keep it absolutely confidential until we can brief the settlement leadership together." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You understand that I could charge you with violating settlement protocols. You understand that your unexplained absences could be considered a security risk." "I understand," Amanda replied. "But what I have to show you is more important than protocols or security procedures. It changes everything about our understanding of this world and our future here." Something in Amanda's voice must have convinced Victoria that this was not a casual request. The human commander made a brief communication on her personal device, instructing her staff that she would be away from the command center for the remainder of the day. She equipped herself with a handheld weapon and activated a personal environmental field that would protect her during the journey to the caves. The journey took them through terrain that grew increasingly isolated as they moved away from the settlement. Victoria's military training was evident in the way she moved, constantly aware of her surroundings, noting exits and defensive positions. She asked Amanda several questions about the cave system, clearly assessing whether this was a trap or some form of deception. Amanda answered honestly. She described the crystal formations, the unusual geological features, the ancient tunnels that seemed to lead deeper into the planet's crust than any human surveying team had ever penetrated. She did not mention the dragons. She wanted Victoria to understand them through direct experience rather than through preconceived expectations. When they reached the cave entrance, Ember was waiting. The small dragon was positioned on a high outcropping of crystal formations, her scales glowing softly in the filtered light that entered through gaps in the rock ceiling. Amanda heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath. "What is that?" Victoria demanded, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon. "That is Ember," Amanda said. "She is a dragon, and there are 2 more where we are going. Please do not be afraid. They will not harm you." Victoria's weapon remained in its holster, but she was clearly making every effort to remain calm. Her military discipline warred with the shock of discovering a completely unknown large creature on a supposedly well-surveyed planet. "How long have you known about this?" Victoria asked, her voice tight. "Since I arrived at the caves 3 years ago," Amanda said. "I have been the only human or elf to know about them. The dragons are not native to Meridian Prime. They came here seeking refuge from something far more dangerous than anything we have encountered so far." As they descended deeper into the cave system, Amanda explained the situation to Victoria. She described the dragons' history, their flight from the Kilian Empire, their need to find a place where they could exist without being hunted or captured. She explained the communication method through the crystals and the mental connection that allowed her to understand what the dragons were thinking and feeling. Victoria listened with the intensity of a military officer, evaluating a strategic situation. When they finally reached the main chamber where Storm and Ash rested, she stood completely still, her eyes taking in every detail of the massive creatures before her. The dragons regarded her with the calm assessment of beings who had encountered many species across many worlds. Storm, the largest, lowered his head slightly in a gesture that Amanda recognized as cautious greeting rather than aggression. "These creatures are genuine," Victoria said quietly. "They are biological beings with sophisticated neural structures. They are dangerous, and they are unlike anything I have ever documented." Amanda placed her hand on Ember's warm scales. She felt the dragon's curiosity flowing through her. The sense of evaluation that all 3 dragons were directing toward this human woman who carried weapons, and the scent of military command. "They are also refugees," Amanda said, "and they are about to become the most valuable military asset that either the human or elf settlement could possibly possess. But only if we approach this correctly." Victoria turned to look at Amanda. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Kilian Empire is coming to Meridian Prime," Amanda said. "The probe we detected is just the beginning. When the Empire discovers that these dragons are here, they will send everything they have to capture them or destroy them. Our colony, both the human section and the elf communities, will be caught in the middle of a conflict we cannot possibly win through military force alone. But with the dragons," Victoria said slowly, "we would have a military advantage that the Kilian Empire would not expect." "No," Amanda said firmly. "With the dragons, we would have a chance to do something the galaxy has never seen before. We would have the opportunity to build an alliance between 3 species that could create a new kind of civilization, one based on cooperation and mutual protection rather than domination and conquest." Victoria was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a soldier who understood both strategy and the cost of different choices. "If I report what I have seen here, the military authorities will come with scientists and weapons specialists. They will want to study these creatures. They will want to weaponize them. And the moment the Kilian Empire knows that we possess this resource, they will attack with everything they have to either take the dragons or destroy them." Amanda nodded. She had known that Victoria would reach this conclusion. "But if you do not report it immediately," Victoria continued, "and if we instead take time to plan how to present this discovery to the colony leadership in a way that emphasizes cooperation rather than military advantage, we might have a chance to change how this situation unfolds. Amanda felt a surge of hope. Then you will help me. Victoria looked back at the dragons, her military mind clearly processing tactical possibilities alongside moral considerations. I will help you, Victoria said, but we are going to need more than just good intentions. We are going to need a strategy that is every bit as sophisticated as any military campaign. Because when the colony leadership learns about these dragons, we are going to face resistance from people who see them only as weapons or threats. We will need to be prepared for every possible argument and every possible objection. Amanda reached out and took Victoria's hand. The human woman was stiff at first, but then she relaxed slightly, allowing Amanda to guide her palm toward Ember's scales. Feel what they are, Amanda said softly. Not what you think they should be, but what they actually are. Feel their consciousness. Feel their desire for peace and survival. Feel their hope that somehow, somewhere, beings like us might see them not as weapons, but as individuals worthy of protection and partnership. Victoria's eyes closed as her hand touched the warm scales of the young dragon. Amanda felt through her connection with Ember that the dragon was opening herself to Victoria, in the same way she had opened herself to Amanda years ago. It was an offering of trust that could never be undone. When Victoria opened her eyes again, they were wet with tears. And in her expression, Amanda saw the moment when a warrior became something more, a diplomat, an ally, a bridge between worlds. Now, Victoria said, let us plan how we are going to change the future of Meridian Prime. The planning session took place over the next 2 weeks in a secure location that Victoria had arranged in an isolated section of the colony. Amanda, Victoria, and 3 other key figures met regularly to discuss how to present the dragons to the colony leadership in a way that emphasized partnership rather than military potential. The 3 others that Victoria had brought into the secret were carefully chosen. First was Dr. Marcus, the chief medical officer of the human settlement, a scientist who had always questioned the militaristic approach to resource development on Meridian Prime. Second was Elder Lithane, one of the eldest and most respected voices in the elf community, a woman who had advocated for peaceful coexistence with humans, even when such views were unpopular among her own people. Third was Professor Hayes, the head of the colony's scientific research division, a man whose curiosity about the natural world sometimes conflicted with his administrative responsibilities, but whose intelligence and integrity were never in question. When Amanda first showed these 3 individuals the dragons, their reactions were as varied as their personalities. Dr. Marcus was immediately fascinated by the biological aspects of the creatures and began asking detailed questions about their physiology and their long lifespans. Elder Lithane stood completely silent for nearly an hour, simply looking at Storm and Ash while the dragons regarded her with calm patience. Professor Hayes moved through several emotional states in rapid succession, from shock to wonder to professional assessment. The dragons, through their mental communication with Amanda, indicated that they trusted these 4 humans and the elf elder. Ash in particular seemed to approve of Elder Lithane, sharing with Amanda the sense that the elf woman possessed wisdom that transcended simple species boundaries. Once all 5 of the humans and elf had agreed to the plan, they began constructing a comprehensive presentation designed to address the specific concerns of different settlement constituencies. For the human military authorities, they prepared documentation showing how the dragons' abilities could contribute to colony defense without requiring them to become weapon systems. For the scientific community, they gathered detailed biological data and information about the dragons' history that would appeal to academic curiosity. For the general settlement population, they crafted a narrative about unity and cooperation that would resonate with the ideals that had drawn colonists to Meridian Prime in the first place. But there was another challenge that they had not anticipated. 2 days before they were scheduled to present the dragons to the full settlement leadership, Victoria received a communication from the Earth authorities. A military assessment team would be arriving at Meridian Prime within 3 weeks to evaluate the colony's security posture and determine whether additional resources would be allocated to human civilian protection. When Victoria told Amanda about this development, the elf woman immediately understood the implication. If the military assessment team arrived before the dragons were formally presented to the colony, the secret would be exposed in the worst possible way. Military personnel would begin their evaluation, discover the unusual energy readings from the cave system, and launch their own investigation that would bring weapons-grade oversight to the entire situation. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Amanda said. "We need to present the dragons to the colony leadership immediately," Victoria agreed. But she also raised the practical concern that called an emergency gathering of all colony leadership, without clear justification, would create suspicion. They needed a legitimate reason to bring everyone together. It was Elder Lithane who provided the solution. She proposed that they frame the gathering as an important announcement about the integration of human and elf communities, a topic that would naturally draw both populations to attend. The elf communities and human settlement had been largely separate despite their physical proximity, each maintaining their own governance structures and cultural practices. The gathering was arranged for the next evening in the central plaza of the human settlement, a large circular space with seating for more than 500 people and communication technology that would allow the gathering to be streamed to the elf settlements and smaller human outposts across the planet. By sunset, more than 1,000 people had assembled. The atmosphere was one of curious anticipation. The human commander made a brief greeting that highlighted the importance of the discussion they were about to hear. Elder Lithane spoke about the shared struggles and common hopes of both populations, and then Amanda stood before the crowd and began to explain why they had all been brought together. She told them about the cave system and the unusual crystal formations. She described her discoveries over the past 5 years of exploration and study. She explained the scientific principles behind the energy signatures that had been detected, and then she paused and took a deep breath before speaking the words that would change everything. "There are beings living in those caves," Amanda said. "Ancient beings who have fled from a place far away seeking sanctuary and safety. They are called dragons, and they are one of the most significant discoveries not just for Meridian Prime, but potentially for all human and elf civilization." The crowd erupted in confused reactions. Some people laughed, thinking this was some kind of joke or entertainment. Others leaned forward intently, realizing that something significant was being shared. A few looked toward the human security personnel as if they expected an explanation or intervention. Amanda gestured, and for the first time, the 3 dragons emerged from the tunnel that had been secretly opened beneath the central plaza. Storm led the way, his massive form causing immediate silence to fall over the entire gathering. Ember followed close behind, her smaller but still impressive frame radiating an almost playful quality. Ash came last, her scales catching the fading light in ways that made her seem almost ethereal. The crowd froze. For several long moments no one moved, no one spoke. No one seemed to even breathe. Then Storm made a low sound that reverberated through the plaza, a harmonic frequency that seemed to resonate with something deep in the human and elf consciousnesses. It was not an attack. It was not a threat. It was an introduction. It was a statement of presence. Amanda began to speak, explaining what these creatures were and where they came from. She described their history and their struggle for survival. She talked about the threat that the Kelian Empire represented not just to the dragons, but to all of Meridian Prime. She outlined how the dragons could contribute to the defense and prosperity of the colony, not as weapons to be controlled, but as partners in building a new kind of civilization. She spoke for nearly an hour, and as she spoke, she could see the gathering's collective understanding shifting. Fear transformed into wonder, suspicion transformed into curiosity. The potential for conflict transformed into the possibility of unprecedented cooperation. When Amanda finally finished speaking, Elder Lithane stood and walked to where the dragons waited. She placed her hand on Storm's scaled neck in a gesture of trust and respect. The elf elder looked back at the crowd and spoke in her deep, resonant voice. "We came to this world seeking a new beginning," she said. "Perhaps the universe has provided us with an opportunity greater than we ever imagined. Perhaps we are meant not to build our civilization alone, but to build it alongside beings whose wisdom and strength could ensure that we all not only survive, but flourish." One by one, other leaders stood and approached the dragons. Victoria was among the first humans to step forward. Dr. Marcus came, followed by Professor Hayes. More human settlers and elf elders joined in the gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance, and as Amanda watched this moment unfold, she felt Storm's consciousness merge with her own, and she understood that the dragon was experiencing something that had not happened in centuries. The dragon was experiencing hope. The morning after the plaza gathering, Amanda woke with a sense of exhausted relief. The dragons had been accepted by the settlement, and while there would certainly be challenges ahead, the immediate crisis had been averted. The secret was no longer secret, and more importantly, it was no longer just her burden to carry. However, her relief was short-lived. She received a message from Victoria informing her that the human military assessment team was changing their arrival schedule and would be arriving on Meridian Prime in 5 days instead of 3 weeks. Someone in Earth's command structure had learned about the unauthorized gathering in the plaza and had interpreted it as a sign of instability or insurrection. The assessment team was now being sent with an expedited timeline to determine whether the colony leadership had lost control of the situation. Amanda understood immediately what this meant. The military assessment team would have full authority to override local colony governance and establish military oversight of all activities. If they arrived with the dragons already publicly acknowledged, they would see them as military assets to be evaluated and potentially seized for transport back to Earth Command. "We need to contact the Earth authorities directly before the assessment team arrives," Amanda said to Victoria during an emergency meeting in the human commander's office. "With what information?" Victoria replied. "We tell them we have peaceful alien creatures on the planet, and they will send a battle cruiser to secure the area. We tell them we are planning to integrate these creatures into our colony structure, and they will dismiss us as having gone native or lost our objectivity about the situation." Amanda felt the weight of the impossible position they occupied. The dragons could not be hidden or protected through silence. But revelation to military authorities carried its own dangers. They needed a third option. It was Elder Lethane who suggested an approach that no one else would have thought to propose. The elf elder came to the meeting with a proposal that drew on traditions and protocols that predated both human and elf colonization of Meridian Prime. "We should call for a council," she said, "not just of humans and elves, but a formal diplomatic council that includes the dragons as recognized participants. We should establish this council as the governing body for all 3 species on Meridian Prime, independent of Earth Command or the distant elf governments. If such a council is formally established with full participation from each species, then any military intervention would be viewed as an act of imperialism or invasion by the Earth authorities." Professor Hayes refined this suggestion into a legal framework. He drew up documentation that presented the 3-species council as a natural evolution of Meridian Prime's settlement governance, a necessary adaptation to unique circumstances that Earth Command had explicitly given the colony authority to manage. The documentation was careful not to directly challenge Earth's authority, but instead framed the council as a practical solution to the unique challenges of governing a mixed human, elf, and dragon population. Victoria, despite her military background and training, understood the elegance and wisdom of this approach. She used her authority as the human military commander to draft an official recommendation to Earth Command suggesting the formation of the council. She presented it not as a radical proposal but as a natural and necessary development in the colony's growth. The documentation and recommendations were transmitted to Earth with detailed explanation of the unique circumstances that necessitated this new governance structure. The message was carefully crafted to emphasize how the council would actually strengthen Earth's influence over the colony by demonstrating responsive and effective leadership rather than rigid adherence to outdated protocols. For 3 days, there was nothing but silence from Earth Command. Amanda spent those days meeting individually with many of the colony's settlement members, both human and elf. She wanted to understand what concerns people had about the dragons, what fears might drive them to welcome military intervention rather than cooperation with alien beings. The responses varied widely. Some people were genuinely excited about the prospect of learning from a civilization that had mastered space travel and achieved such longevity. Others were terrified of what they perceived as a loss of human superiority and control. Some worried about the practical implications of sharing resources in space with creatures as large and potentially dangerous as dragons. Others seemed concerned about religious or philosophical implications of sharing their world with beings so different from themselves. Amanda listened to all of these concerns without dismissing any of them. She understood that genuine fear and legitimate questions were not the same as hostility or prejudice. She worked to address the practical concerns with concrete proposals. For the religious and philosophical concerns, she encouraged dialogues between community leaders and the dragons through her role as translator and intermediary. On the fourth day after the message was sent to Earth, a response finally came. The military assessment team's arrival had been pushed back again. Earth Command had decided to defer its military evaluation, pending the establishment of the Three-Species Council and a formal report on its effectiveness. The decision emphasized that the military assessment would still occur, but Earth was willing to give the colony's governance structure a chance to prove itself. It was not a complete victory. The military oversight was only postponed, not canceled. But it gave the colony time. Time to build relationships, time to establish protocols, time to demonstrate that the three-species cooperation could be effective and stable. The formal establishment of the council took place 1 week later. Amanda, representing the dragons through her role as their designated speaker and advocate, sat beside Storm in the council chamber. On the other side of the chamber sat Victoria, representing the human population, and Elder Lithane representing the elf communities. The first formal act of the Three-Species Council was to establish protocols for resource sharing, security cooperation, and decision-making processes that would balance the interests and needs of all three populations. The second was to create educational programs that would help humans and elves understand dragon biology, history, and culture. The third was to establish a defense strategy that would prepare Meridian Prime for the eventual arrival of Keelian forces. But perhaps the most important act was the least formal. After all the official business was concluded, Storm stood and placed his massive head against Amanda's chest. The dragon was performing a gesture of trust and alliance that Amanda recognized from their shared mental connection. It meant that the dragons recognized Amanda not just as their representative, but as their bridge to a future that none of them could yet fully imagine. Victoria and Elder Lithane rose to their feet in respect to the gesture, and Amanda felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Against all odds, they had created something unprecedented. Three species, brought together not through conquest or domination, but through genuine partnership and mutual respect. The dragons had not come to Meridian Prime seeking weapons or servants. They had come seeking refuge, and they had found instead the possibility of genuine belonging. 6 months after the establishment of the Three-Species Council, Meridian Prime had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The dragon caves had been carefully mapped and studied, with protective zones established to ensure that the dragons had spaces where they could rest and meditate without intrusion. A new district of the main settlement had been constructed to accommodate the occasional presence of the dragons when they chose to participate in colony activities or consult with the council. The dragons themselves had become teachers, sharing knowledge about space travel, stellar navigation, and advanced technologies that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom from civilizations across the galaxy. They provided information about the Keelian Empire that allowed the colony's strategists to develop more effective defensive plans. More importantly, they offered hope. They demonstrated through their very presence that cooperation between different species was not just theoretically possible but practically achievable. Amanda had taken on the role of primary translator and ambassador between the dragons and the human and elf populations. It was exhausting work that demanded constant mental and emotional presence, but it was also profoundly rewarding. She moved between the caves and the settlement with increasing ease, her status as the bridge between species giving her a unique position that allowed her to see both the remarkable progress and the lingering tensions. There were still problems. Some humans remained deeply suspicious of the dragons, particularly among the military contingent that viewed them as potential threats. Some elders in the elf community questioned whether humans could be trusted as genuine partners, rather than rivals for resources and power. There were incidents of vandalism and hostile communication, directed at locations where dragons were known to gather, but there were also daily examples of genuine connection and understanding. Children from both human and elf families would gather near the dragon observation areas, watching the magnificent creatures with wonder and asking endless questions about how dragons thought and felt and what they had experienced in the vast spaces beyond. Meridian Prime's sky, the most significant development, came when Storm approached Amanda with a proposal that had implications far beyond anything they had previously discussed. Storm had been communicating with Ash and Ember regularly through methods of long-distance telepathic connection that Amanda still did not fully understand. Through these communications, he had been reaching out to other dragons scattered across the galaxy, dragons that had also fled from Keelian persecution and were hiding on remote planets or in the outer regions of distant solar systems. Storm wanted Meridian Prime to become a beacon, a signal sent across space that would tell every surviving dragon that Sanctuary existed, that they were no longer alone, that there were species in the galaxy willing to welcome them without conditions or demands. But such a beacon would inevitably draw the attention of the Keelian Empire. It would announce to the universe that a three-species alliance had formed specifically to protect dragons. It would turn Meridian Prime from a modest colonial settlement into a potential flashpoint in a conflict that had lasted for centuries. Amanda brought Storm's proposal to the council in a private meeting with Victoria and Elder Lithane. She did not attempt to hide what she believed about it. She believed it was both incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. If we send this beacon, Victoria said carefully, we are essentially declaring that we are willing to go to war with the Keelian Empire. We are inviting them to see us not as an insignificant colony to be ignored, but as a direct challenge to their authority. And if we do not send it, Elder Lithane responded, we are condemning thousands of surviving dragons to lives of hiding and isolation. We are essentially agreeing that might makes right, and that the Keelian Empire has the authority to commit genocide across the galaxy unchallenged. The debate continued for hours, exploring every implication and consequence, but ultimately Amanda realized that this was not a decision that the human and elf leadership should make. This was a decision that belonged to the dragons themselves. She called a formal meeting in the Dragon Chamber, with Storm, Ash, and Ember present. She explained that the beacon represented a choice. Once sent, it could not be unsent. Once the Keelian Empire knew they were here, there would be no returning to peaceful obscurity. Storm's response was to share a vision with Amanda that was so powerful it brought her to her knees. The dragon showed her the centuries of loneliness, the endless flight from one world to another, the constant fear, the loss of entire populations to weapons and enslavement, and then he showed her what Meridian Prime could become. A place where dragons could walk under open skies without hiding, a place where they could raise young and build communities, a place where they might actually have a future rather than just a prolonged dying. Amanda understood then that Storm had already made his choice. The question was whether the colony would honor that choice. The council voted unanimously to send the beacon. The decision was made with full knowledge of the consequences, but also with recognition that some things were worth the risk. Some futures were worth fighting for. The beacon was constructed in collaboration between human engineers, elf scholars, and dragon wisdom. It transmitted a message across multiple spectrums of light and energy, penetrating the vast distances of space and carrying with it the coordinates of Meridian Prime. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. The colony settled into an anxious waiting period, unsure whether the beacon had even been successful or whether they had taken a tremendous risk for nothing. And then, on the 22nd day, multiple ships entered the Meridian Prime system. They were small craft, capable of rapid travel but not designed for warfare. As they approached, communications began flowing between the incoming ships and the colony. The dragons were coming, dozens of them, driven across the galaxy by hope and the beacon's promise of sanctuary. Amanda stood with Storm and looked up at the sky as the first dragon ships descended through the atmosphere. She could feel through her connection with Storm the overwhelming emotion. It was not joy exactly, though it contained joy. It was something deeper and more complex. It was the recognition that survival was possible, that the species would continue, that the future might hold something other than endless hiding and gradual extinction. Victoria stood beside Amanda, and the human commander placed her hand on Amanda's shoulder. "This changes everything," Victoria said simply, and Amanda understood that she was right. What had begun as a personal relationship between an elf woman and 3 dragons had become something far greater. It had become a seed from which something entirely new might grow, a new kind of civilization, a new kind of hope, a new kind of future. Storm spread his wings wide, catching the light of Meridian Prime's red sun. Ash and Ember joined him, their forms silhouetted against the sky as new dragons descended from the stars. The age of hiding was ending. The age of genuine coexistence was beginning, and Amanda, standing between her dragon companions and the human and elf populations that had become her family, understood that this was only the beginning of a story that would be told and retold across galaxies for generations to come.